John Smith rubbed his tired eyes and took another sip of his cold coffee. As the producer of this week's episode of The View, he had been working 16-hour days to make sure everything went perfectly. The show had been struggling with ratings lately, and the network executives were breathing down his neck. He needed something special, something that would get people talking and watching again. His phone rang. It was his assistant, Betty White. "John, you won't believe this," Betty said, her voice high with excitement. "Clint Eastwood's agent just called. He's available for Thursday's show. They said he wants to talk about his new Western film." John nearly spilled his coffee. Getting Clint Eastwood was a huge deal. At 93, the legendary actor and director rarely did talk shows anymore. This could be exactly what they needed to boost their ratings. "That's amazing news, Betty. Lock it in right now before they change their minds," John said, already thinking about how to promote the appearance. He had just hung up when his phone rang again. This time it was Susan Adams, his booking coordinator. "I just got off the phone with Robert De Niro's people," Susan said. "They want him on the show this Thursday to talk about his new political drama." John sat up straight in his chair. "This Thursday? Are you sure?" Yes, they were very specific about the date. Apparently it's the only day that works with his press tour schedule. John's mind raced. Having either Clint Eastwood or Robert De Niro would be a coup for the show. Having both on the same day would be historic. These were two of the biggest living legends in Hollywood, with careers spanning decades. But they were also known to have very different political views. Eastwood was famously conservative, while De Niro was outspoken about his liberal positions. "Should I try to reschedule one of them?" Susan asked, sensing John's hesitation. John thought for a moment. Then a slow smile spread across his face. "No. Book them both. Same episode." "Both? Are you sure that's a good idea?" Susan sounded worried. "They've never appeared together before. There are rumors they don't get along." "Exactly," John said. "Think about it, Susan. Two of the greatest actors of all time face-to-face, possibly disagreeing on national television. The viewers will love it. Or it could be a complete disaster," Susan pointed out. "In the TV business, there's no such thing as bad publicity," John said, though he wasn't entirely convinced of that himself. "Just make sure their agents don't find out the other one will be there until it's too late to back out." After hanging up, John called an emergency meeting with his production team. They gathered in the small conference room next to his office. The room buzzed with excitement as John shared the news. "This could be the highest-rated episode we've had in years," said Gary Peters, the marketing director. "We should start promoting it right away." Mary Williams, the head writer, looked concerned. "These are two very different men, with very different political views," she said. "This could either be television gold or a complete disaster." "Mary's right," said Frank Hill, another producer. "We need to be careful how we handle this. The wrong question could turn the whole thing into a shouting match." John nodded. "That's why we need to prepare for every possibility. I want talking. Points that are safe but still interesting. I want backup questions if things get too heated. And I want exit strategies if it all goes south." The team worked late into the night, planning every detail of the episode. They decided not to tell the show's hosts, Patricia Miller and Barbara Jones, about the potential conflict. Patricia and Barbara were excellent at handling unexpected situations, and John thought their natural reactions would make for better television. The next morning, John arrived at the studio to find a message waiting for him. Robert De Niro's agent wanted to know who else would be on the show that day. John told his assistant to say they were still finalizing the guest list. Later that day, Clint Eastwood's agent called with the same question. John gave the same answer. "This is getting complicated," Betty said after handling the second call. "Do you really think we can keep this a secret until they both arrive?" "We have to try," John said. "If either one finds out, they might cancel." As the day of the show approached, the entire staff was on edge. The promotional spots airing on the network only mentioned that legendary Oscar winners would be appearing, without naming names. Social media was already buzzing with speculation. The night before the big day, John barely slept. He kept imagining worst-case scenarios. Eastwood and De Niro refusing to sit on the same stage, one of them walking out mid-show, or a heated argument that went too far. But he also imagined the best-case scenario, a ratings bonanza that would save his job and maybe even win the show an Emmy for Outstanding Entertainment Talk Show. On Thursday morning, John arrived at the studio 3 hours early. The makeup and dressing rooms had been carefully arranged so that Eastwood and De Niro would be kept apart until the show began. Extra security was on hand in case things got out of control. Clint Eastwood was scheduled to arrive first. John paced nervously by the back entrance, checking his watch every few minutes. At exactly 7:30 a.m., a black SUV pulled up. The door opened, and out stepped Clint Eastwood. Despite his age, he moved with purpose, his tall frame still imposing. He wore a simple but elegant gray suit with no tie, looking every bit the Hollywood legend he was. "Mr. Eastwood," John said, extending his hand. "Thank you so much for coming. It's an honor to have you on the show." Eastwood shook his hand firmly. "Thanks for having me," he said in his famously quiet, gravelly voice. John led him inside to the green room, where Patricia Miller was waiting to greet him. She was secretly nervous about the upcoming segment, though she hid it well behind her professional smile. "We've prepared a private room for you to relax before the show," John told Eastwood. "Is there anything you need?" "Just some coffee, Black," Eastwood replied. "And not too much makeup. I don't want to look like I'm trying to hide my age." John nodded and left Eastwood with Patricia, then hurried back to the entrance. Robert DeRay. Niro was due to arrive any minute. John's phone buzzed with a text from Susan. De Niro's car just pulled up to security gate. 30 minutes after Eastwood's arrival, Robert De Niro walked through the door. He was shorter than Eastwood but had a powerful presence of his own. He wore a dark blue suit with a light blue shirt, looking polished and prepared. "Mr. De Niro, welcome to The View," John said, trying to sound calm. "We're thrilled to have you with us today." De Niro nodded. "Thanks. Who else is on the show today?" The direct question caught John off guard. "We have a few guests. Patricia can fill you in on all the details." As John led De Niro toward a different green room, he noticed Eastwood's security person watching from down the hall. The atmosphere in the studio had noticeably shifted. Producer Richard Brown noticed how both men acknowledged each other with nothing more than brief nods when they briefly crossed paths, the tension palpable. The crew exchanged worried glances as the two legends were settled in rooms at opposite ends of the backstage area. "I've worked on this show for 15 years, camera operator Nancy Clark whispered to a colleague, "and I've never felt a room so charged with energy. It's like watching two gunslingers sizing each other up." John gathered the hosts for a final briefing just 10 minutes before they went live. He finally revealed the full situation to them. "You've booked both Eastwood and De Niro on the same show, without telling either of them?" Barbara Jones looked both shocked and impressed. "That's either the bravest or stupidest thing you've ever done," Patricia said. "Probably both," John admitted. "Just keep things moving and try to find common ground. These are two of the greatest actors ever. Surely they can be professional for 1 hour." As the makeup artists applied final touches to the hosts, John took his position in the control room. Through his headset, he could hear the floor director counting down. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. The show's theme music played, the lights came up, and The View was on the air. John took a deep breath. There was no turning back now. The bright studio lights felt hot as Patricia Miller and Barbara Jones welcomed the audience to The View. Their smiles were extra wide today, their voices slightly higher than normal. The crew could feel the tension in the air. "We have an incredible show for you today," Patricia said, looking directly into camera one. "Two of the greatest actors in Hollywood history will be joining us." Behind the scenes, John Smith watched nervously from the control room. So far, so good. Neither Eastwood nor De Niro had discovered they would be appearing together. At least not yet. "First, let's welcome a true American icon," Barbara announced. "He's won 4 Academy Awards, directed over 30 films, and at 93 years old, he's still making some of the best movies in Hollywood. Please welcome the legendary Clint Eastwood." The audience erupted in applause as Clint Eastwood walked onto the stage. He moved slower than in his prime, but still had the straight-backed confidence that had made him famous. He smiled slightly and gave a small wave to the audience before sitting down. "Thank you for being here, Mr. Eastwood," Patricia said. "It's such an honor." "Call me Clint," he said in his quiet, gravelly voice. "And thanks for having me." They chatted easily about his new Western film. Eastwood was never a man of many words, but he answered their questions thoughtfully. The audience hung on every word. In the control room, John began to relax a little. Maybe this would work out after all. Then it was time for the first commercial break. "We'll be right back with more from Clint Eastwood," Barbara told the audience. "And later, another very special guest will be joining us." As soon as they were off air, John rushed to the stage. "Everything okay?" he asked Eastwood. The actor nodded. "Fine. Great. Just so you know, we'll be bringing out our other guest after the break. You'll both be on stage together for the second segment." Eastwood raised an eyebrow. "Who's the other guest?" Before John could answer, the floor director called out, "1 minute to air." John hurried back to the control room, ignoring Eastwood's question. His heart was pounding. There was no going back now. When they returned from the break, Patricia smiled at the camera. "If one Hollywood legend wasn't enough, we have another joining us today. He starred in some of the most important films in American cinema, from The Godfather Part 2 to Raging Bull. Please welcome Robert De Niro." The audience cheered wildly as De Niro walked out. He smiled and waved, then stopped short when he saw Eastwood already seated on the couch. For just a moment, surprise flashed across his face before his actor's training took over, and his expression became neutral again. De Niro nodded to Eastwood as he took his seat at the opposite end of the couch. "Clint." "Robert," Eastwood replied, with a slight nod of his own. The air between them felt electric. Everyone in the studio could sense it. Barbara rushed to fill the silence. "Isn't this wonderful? Two of the greatest actors of all time, together on our show." Neither man responded directly to that. They sat like two old gunfighters, sizing each other up from across a dusty street. In the control room, Susan whispered to John, "I've never seen anything this awkward on live TV." "Just wait," John replied. "It's either going to get much better or much worse." Patricia tried to keep things moving. "Robert, tell us about your new film. I understand it deals with some political themes?" De Niro leaned forward slightly. "Yes, it's about the division in American politics today. How we've lost the ability to talk to each other, to find common ground." He glanced at Eastwood as he said this, almost like a challenge. "And you play a politician?" Barbara asked. "A former politician who tries to bridge the gap," De Niro explained. "But he faces resistance from both sides. People today, they don't want solutions. They just want to be right." Eastwood shifted in his seat but said nothing. "Clint," Patricia said, turning. "To him, your films often deal with American values as well, though perhaps from a different perspective. Do you find any common ground with the themes in Robert's new movie?" Eastwood took his time answering. "I haven't seen his film," he said finally. "But sure, there's common ground. We're all Americans. We all want what's best for the country. We just disagree on how to get there." De Niro nodded slightly. "That's true, but some of us spend more time thinking about what's best for everyone, not just ourselves." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Barbara and Patricia exchanged worried glances. "Let's talk about your careers," Barbara said quickly. "You've both been in Hollywood for decades. How have you seen the industry change?" "It's gotten soft," Eastwood said immediately. "Too concerned with saying the right thing instead of telling good stories." De Niro leaned forward. "Or maybe it's finally giving voice to people who were ignored for too long." The hosts looked increasingly nervous. This was exactly what John had hoped for and feared. "Both of you have directed as well as acted," Patricia said. "Do you find one more satisfying than the other?" This safer topic seemed to ease the tension slightly. Both men spoke about their love of directing and the challenges it presented compared to acting. For a few minutes, they almost seemed to forget their differences. Then Barbara asked, Do you think actors should use their fame to speak out on political issues? The question hung in the air. In the control room, John muttered, "That wasn't in the approved question list." De Niro answered first. "I think we have a responsibility. People listen to us. If we see something wrong happening in our country, we should say something." He looked directly at Eastwood now. "Staying silent is a political choice too." Eastwood met his gaze. "I agree that silence is a choice, and sometimes it's the right one. Not every actor needs to share every thought they have. Most folks don't go to movies to get political lectures. So we should just entertain?" De Niro asked, his voice rising slightly. "Just be clowns while Rome burns?" "I didn't say that," Eastwood replied calmly. "But there's a difference between having opinions and thinking your opinions matter more because you're famous." The tension between them was now obvious to everyone. The audience sat in complete silence, not even a cough or a whisper. It was like watching a high-wire act without a net. In the control room, Frank turned to John. "Should we go to commercial?" John shook his head. "Not yet. This is what we wanted." On stage, Patricia tried to regain control. "Let's talk about your methods as actors. You come from very different schools of thought, don't you?" But neither man seemed interested in changing the subject now. "I've always respected your work, Clint," De Niro said, his tone more measured now. "But I've never understood how someone who makes films about justice and standing up for what's right could support some of the policies you do." Eastwood's face remained impassive. "And I've always thought you were one of the best actors alive. But I think you live in a bubble, Robert. The Hollywood bubble, where everyone thinks the same and pats each other on the back for it." The hosts looked like they wanted to disappear. The planned questions about favorite roles and future projects seemed impossible now. In the control room, John watched intently. This was raw, unfiltered, and completely unpredictable. It was also the most compelling television The View had produced in years. "We should probably take a break," Barbara suggested weakly. But before they could go to commercial, Eastwood leaned forward in his chair. "Let me ask you something, Robert," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "Have you ever actually talked to someone who disagrees with you? Really talked, not just dismissed them?" De Niro seemed surprised by the question. For a moment he didn't answer. "We'll be right back after these messages," Patricia said quickly. As soon as the cameras were off, the studio erupted in chaos. The hosts huddled together, whispering urgently. Crew members looked at each other with wide eyes, but most surprising, of all, Eastwood and De Niro remained seated, still looking at each other. "Well?" Eastwood asked, continuing his question even though they were no longer on air. "Have you?" De Niro considered the question. "Probably not as much as I should," he admitted finally. John rushed onto the stage. "Gentlemen, that was intense. Do you want to continue after the break, or should we end the segment?" Eastwood looked at De Niro. De Niro looked back. Something unspoken passed between them. "We'll continue," they said, almost in unison. The commercial break seemed to last forever. Makeup artists rushed onto the stage to touch up the hosts and guests. Patricia and Barbara spoke quietly with the show's producers, their faces showing clear concern. The audience whispered among themselves, excited by the unexpected tension between the two Hollywood legends. John Smith paced behind the cameras, both worried and thrilled. This was exactly the kind of television moment producers dreamed about, but it could also spin out of control at any second. "Are you sure about this?" Susan asked him. "Things are getting pretty heated out there." "It's real," John replied. "That's what makes it good television." When the floor director counted down to the return from commercial, everyone in the studio held their breath. The red light on the camera turned on, and they were live again. "Welcome back to The View," Patricia said, her voice steady despite her nerves. "We're here with Clint Eastwood and Robert De Niro discussing their careers and perspectives on Hollywood." Barbara jumped in. "Before the break, you were talking about communication across political differences. Would you like to continue that conversation?" De Niro nodded. "I was thinking during the break about what Clint asked me, about whether I really talk to people who disagree with me." He paused, choosing his words carefully. And he's right that I probably don't do that enough. But I also think there are some values that aren't up for debate. Eastwood leaned back in his chair, looking relaxed despite the tension. Like what? Like basic human dignity, De Niro said firmly. Like treating people with respect regardless of where they come from, or what they look like. I don't think anyone would argue with that, Eastwood replied. The disagreement comes in how we put those values into practice. The audience was completely silent, watching the two men like a tennis match. I respect Robert's work immensely. Eastwood continued with his characteristic measured tone. But I've always believed actors should be careful about leveraging their fame for political influence. Most of us have no special knowledge or expertise. We're just better known than the average person. De Niro's response was immediate. And I've always believed that silence in the face of injustice is complicity. He countered, his intensity building with each word. When you see something wrong happening, you speak up. That's true whether you're famous or not. Patricia tried to steer the conversation back to safer ground. Let's talk about your approaches to acting. You come from very different schools of thought, don't you? But neither man seemed interested in changing the subject now. They were fully engaged in what had become an ideological confrontation decades in the making. The problem I have, Eastwood said, is when actors use their platform to lecture ordinary Americans about how they should live, what they should think, or who they should vote for. It comes across as condescending. And the problem I have, De Niro fired back, is when people with influence stay silent while rights are being taken away and norms are being destroyed. The hosts exchanged worried glances. This was not going according to plan. In the control room, producers frantically debated whether to cut to another commercial, but something unexpected was happening. Despite their disagreement, both men were listening to each other. There was tension, yes, but also a strange kind of respect forming between them. You made a film about Iwo Jima, De Niro said suddenly. 2 films, actually, showing both the American and Japanese perspectives of the same battle. Eastwood looked surprised at the change of topic. I did. That showed a lot of empathy, De Niro continued. The ability to see both sides of a story, to understand that even your enemies are human beings with their own perspective. Thank you, Eastwood said quietly. That was important to me. So, why don't you bring that same empathy to our current political situation? De Niro asked. Why can't you see that some of the policies you support hurt real people? The question hung in the air. The audience seemed to collectively hold its breath. Eastwood took his time before answering. I could ask you the same question, he said finally. Why don't you try to understand why millions of Americans don't share your views? Why assume they're all wrong or misguided? In the control room, John watched the monitors intently. This was turning into something more meaningful than he had expected. It wasn't just conflict for the sake of ratings anymore. These 2 men were having a real conversation about important issues. Cut to Barbara, he instructed the director. Let's see if she can build on this. Barbara leaned forward. It seems like you're both talking about the same thing in different ways. The importance of empathy and understanding other perspectives. Would you agree with that? Both men considered this. Maybe, De Niro conceded. But empathy has limits. Some things are just wrong. Of course, Eastwood agreed. But who decides what's wrong? You? Me? Some group of elites in Hollywood or Washington? Not me personally, De Niro said. But collectively as a society we've agreed on certain values: equality, justice, freedom. Those are just words, Eastwood replied. Empty words unless we agree on what they mean in practice. And that's where the disagreement comes in. Patricia saw an opportunity to bring the conversation to a more personal level. You've both lived through significant changes in American society. You were both adults during the civil rights movement, Vietnam, Watergate. How have those experiences shaped your views? This question seemed to reach both men. For the first time, they looked at each other with real curiosity rather than opposition. I was in the Army during the Korean War, Eastwood said. Never saw combat, but I learned a lot about duty and responsibility, about doing what needs to be done without complaining. De Niro nodded. I was too young for Korea, and I didn't serve in Vietnam. But I grew up in New York in a neighborhood with all kinds of people. I saw firsthand how some people were treated differently because of who they were. For a moment, they were just two old men sharing stories, not political opponents. Look, Eastwood said, leaning forward. I've spent decades watching Hollywood drift further from the American people it claims to represent. The problem isn't the politics, it's the preaching. And I've spent decades watching rights that people fought and died for being threatened. De Niro responded. Sometimes preaching is necessary. In the production booth, chaos reigned. Executive producer Laura Martinez frantically signaled to go to commercial, but host Patricia Miller, recognizing the historic television moment unfolding, subtly ignored the direction. We should wrap this up, Laura said into John's earpiece. This is getting too intense. No way, John replied. This is gold. Let them keep going. On stage, the conversation continued to evolve. What had started as a tense confrontation was becoming something more nuanced. Neither man was backing down from his position, but they were actually listening to each other. You played Dirty Harry, De Niro said, a cop who breaks the rules to get justice. A character, Eastwood pointed out. Not me. But you chose those roles, De Niro pressed. Roles about justice, about standing up for what's right even when it's not popular or easy. Eastwood nodded slowly. I did, and you played Travis Bickle, a disturbed man who thinks violence is the answer to society's problems. A cautionary tale, De Niro said. Not a hero. Exactly, Eastwood replied. So maybe we shouldn't assume we know each other based on the roles we've played or the sound bites in the media. The audience, which had been silent for most of this exchange, suddenly burst into applause. Even Patricia and Barbara looked surprised by this moment of connection. We need to go to commercial, Patricia said reluctantly. But we'll be right back with more from Clint Eastwood and Robert De Niro. As the cameras turned off, neither man moved to leave the stage. Instead, they continued talking, oblivious to the activity around them. John rushed onto the stage. That was amazing, he said. Absolutely perfect television. Neither actor seemed to care about his approval. We're not done yet, Eastwood said simply. De Niro nodded in agreement. We're just getting started. When The View returned from the commercial break, something had changed in the studio. The audience could feel it. The tension between Eastwood and De Niro was still there, but it had transformed into something more complex. There was a sense of mutual challenge now, like two master chess players studying the board between them. Welcome back, Patricia said. We're having a fascinating conversation with Clint Eastwood and Robert De Niro. She paused, not sure how to continue. The segment had gone so far off script that the planned questions seemed pointless now. Barbara stepped in. Before the break, you were discussing your different perspectives on Hollywood and politics. Clint, you mentioned that you feel there's too much preaching in the industry. Eastwood nodded. Hollywood has always been liberal. That's nothing new. But there used to be more room for different voices, different perspectives. He looked directly at De Niro. Now it feels like everyone's expected to think the same way, say the same things. That's not about conformity, De Niro replied. It's about basic values, about standing against hate and division. No one's in favor of hate, Eastwood said, his voice still calm but with an edge to it now. But we can disagree about policies, without one side calling the other hateful. The hosts looked nervous, but the producers in the control room were ecstatic. The show was trending on social media already, with viewers tuning in to watch the unexpected debate between two Hollywood legends. Let me ask you something, Robert, Eastwood continued. Do you have friends who voted differently than you in the last election? De Niro hesitated. A few. And do you think they're bad people? No, De Niro admitted. But I think they made a bad choice. And that's your right, Eastwood said. Just like it's their right to think you made a bad choice. That's what America is about, the freedom to disagree. De Niro leaned forward. But some disagreements matter more than others. When policies hurt real people, staying silent isn't an option. I agree, Eastwood said, surprising everyone. But we need to be able to talk about those policies without demonizing each other, without assuming the worst about people who disagree with us. For a moment, De Niro seemed at a loss for words. This wasn't the conversation he had expected to have. Barbara saw an opportunity. It sounds like you both value respectful dialogue. Is that something you think is missing in our current political climate? Absolutely, Eastwood said without hesitation. Yes, De Niro agreed. But respect has to be earned. It has to be based on truth, not lies. And just like that, the tension was back. Eastwood's eyes narrowed slightly. And who decides what's true? You? The media? Politicians? Facts decide, De Niro said firmly. Science. Evidence. But facts can be interpreted different ways, Eastwood countered, and chosen selectively to support whatever position you already hold. In the control room, John watched in amazement. What was happening on stage wasn't just good television. It was a microcosm of the national conversation, the divide that had split America down the middle. This is incredible, he said to Susan. They're having the exact conversation the whole country needs to have. On stage, the debate continued. What was meant to be a light celebrity interview had transformed into a passionate discussion about artistic responsibility, politics, and American values. Let me tell you something about America, Eastwood said, his voice dropping even lower, forcing everyone to listen carefully. I've lived through 14 presidents. I've seen this country face challenges that would have destroyed other nations. And we always pull through because beneath all our differences, there's something that unites us. What's that? De Niro asked, genuinely curious now. The belief that we can disagree and still live together, still be neighbors, still be Americans. Eastwood paused. At least, that's how it used to be. The audience was completely silent, hanging on every word. De Niro nodded slowly. I remember that America. But I also remember an America where certain people weren't welcome at the table, where they couldn't vote, couldn't live where they wanted, couldn't marry who they loved. And we've made progress on those things, Eastwood acknowledged. Real progress. But change takes time, and forcing it too quickly causes resentment, pushback. So, people should just be patient while their rights are denied? De Niro challenged. No, Eastwood said. But lasting change happens through persuasion, not force, through conversation, not cancellation. Eastwood, with his direct, no-nonsense approach, challenged De Niro's positions with unexpected statistics and personal anecdotes from his time as mayor of Carmel. The audience watched in stunned silence as Eastwood methodically addressed each point raised by De Niro. During my time as mayor, Eastwood said, I worked with people across the political spectrum, people I disagreed with on almost everything. But we found common ground because we focused on solving problems, not winning arguments. De Niro seemed impressed despite himself. That's easier in local politics. The stakes feel lower. Are they? Eastwood asked. Tell that to the family that can't afford housing, or the business owner who can't navigate regulations, or the kid whose school is failing. National politics gets all the attention, but local issues affect people's daily lives. Patricia tried to regain some control of the segment. Both of you have played political figures in films. How did those roles shape your understanding of politics? Acting is about empathy, De Niro said. About understanding someone else's perspective, even if you disagree with it. Maybe especially if you disagree with it. Exactly, Eastwood agreed. And that's what's missing from our political conversation today. The ability to understand why someone might see things differently than we do. The two men looked at each other with new appreciation. They were still on opposite sides politically, but they had found unexpected common ground in their approach to acting and to understanding human nature. You've directed movies about American history, De Niro said to Eastwood. About our failures, as well as our successes. That takes courage. So have you, Eastwood replied. We've both tried to tell the truth as we see it. The truth as we see it, De Niro repeated thoughtfully. Maybe that's the key phrase. We all see different parts of the truth. The production booth was in chaos. Executive producer Laura Martinez couldn't believe what she was witnessing. What had started as a potentially explosive confrontation was evolving into something much more valuable. "We need to give them more time," she said to John. "Forget the other segments. This is what people need to see." John nodded in agreement. "Tell Patricia and Barbara to keep it going." On stage, the conversation continued to deepen. Eastwood shared stories from his childhood during the Great Depression, how it had shaped his views on self-reliance and government. De Niro talked about growing up in New York City, surrounded by immigrants and working-class families struggling to get by. "We came from different Americas," De Niro realized aloud. "Maybe we still live in different Americas. But it's still America," Eastwood said. "Still worth fighting for. Still worth talking about." The audience, which had been silent for much of the exchange, suddenly burst into applause. It wasn't for one man or the other, but for the conversation itself, for the rare sight of two people with opposing views actually listening to each other. Patricia looked at her watch and realized they were almost out of time. "We have to wrap up soon," she said reluctantly. "But before we go, is there anything else you'd like to say to each other?" Eastwood looked at De Niro for a long moment. "Just that I've respected your work for decades. And after today, I respect you as a person too, even though we disagree on many things." De Niro nodded. "Same here. It's easy to make someone a cartoon villain when you don't know them. Harder when you've actually talked to them." "We'll be right back with our final segment," Barbara said as they cut to commercial. As soon as the cameras were off, the audience erupted in applause again. Many people were standing, some were even wiping away tears. In the control room, the production team looked at each other in amazement. "Did that just happen?" Susan asked. "Yes," John said, smiling broadly. "Yes, it did." On stage, Eastwood and De Niro continued talking through the break, oblivious to the commotion around them. Two old warriors who had finally met on the battlefield, only to discover they were fighting for the same thing after all. The final commercial break of the show seemed to fly by. The production team buzzed with excitement. The segment with Eastwood and De Niro had gone in a completely unexpected direction, and social media was exploding with reactions. News outlets were already picking up the story, with headlines about the surprising conversation between the two Hollywood legends. "This is going to win us an Emmy," Laura told John as they prepared for the final segment. "I've never seen anything like it on daytime television." John nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. Something more important than ratings or awards had happened on that stage. Two men with deeply opposing political views had found a way to talk to each other with respect and genuine curiosity. In today's divided America, that felt like a small miracle. 5 seconds to air, the floor director called out. The red light on the camera came on and the view was back live. "Welcome back," Patricia said. "We're here with Clint Eastwood and Robert De Niro for our final segment today." The audience applauded enthusiastically. Many people had their phones out recording this historic television moment. "Before we wrap up," Barbara said, "I want to thank both of you for what has been one of the most remarkable conversations we've ever had on this show." Both men nodded in acknowledgement, but they seemed more interested in continuing their discussion than in the host's praise. "You mentioned earlier that you've never really talked before today," Patricia said, "despite both being in Hollywood for so many decades." "That's right," Eastwood confirmed. "Our paths just never crossed much. Or maybe we avoided each other," De Niro suggested with a small smile. "Given our different views." "Probably some of both," Eastwood agreed. "And yet today you've had this incredibly thoughtful conversation about politics, America, and the role of artists in society," Barbara noted. "What changed?" The two men looked at each other. For a moment, neither spoke. The studio was completely silent. Then, unexpectedly, Eastwood chuckled. "You know," he said, 40 years in this business and this is the first real conversation we've ever had." De Niro's stern expression gradually softened into a reluctant smile. "Maybe that's the problem with America right now. Not enough real conversations." The audience burst into applause again. Even Patricia and Barbara looked moved. "I think you might be right," Eastwood continued when the applause died down. We all stay in our bubbles. Talk to people who already agree with us. Watch news that confirms what we already believe. It's easier that way, De Niro acknowledged. Comfortable. But maybe too comfortable. Exactly, Eastwood said, warming to the topic. Democracy isn't supposed to be comfortable. It's supposed to be challenging. It requires us to engage with different ideas, different perspectives. De Niro nodded thoughtfully. I was thinking about what you said earlier about your time as mayor, about working with people you disagreed with to solve practical problems. That's where common ground usually exists, Eastwood said. In the practical, not the ideological. I can see that, De Niro admitted. When you move past labels and talking points, you often find areas of agreement. The hosts exchanged amazed glances. This was not the confrontation they had expected when the show began. Instead, they were witnessing something much more valuable, a model for how Americans with different political views might actually talk to each other. For example, Eastwood continued, I bet we both want good schools, safe neighborhoods, and opportunities for young people. We probably just disagree on how to achieve those things. That's true, De Niro said. And those disagreements matter. They're important. But they don't make either of us the enemy. In the control room, John felt a lump in his throat. What had started as a ratings grab had turned into something genuinely meaningful. The show's Twitter account was being flooded with messages from viewers saying how refreshing it was to see civil dialogue between political opponents. One last question, Patricia said, aware that they were almost out of time. What will you take away from this conversation today? Eastwood thought for a moment. I'll remember that assumptions are usually wrong. I had certain ideas about Robert, based on things I'd read or heard. After actually talking with him, I realized those ideas were incomplete at best. De Niro nodded in agreement. Same here. It's easy to make someone into a caricature when you don't know them personally. Much harder when you've looked them in the eye and heard their story. Would you be willing to continue this conversation somewhere else after the show? Barbara asked. What followed surprised everyone. The two legends began finding common ground on issues of creative independence, studio interference, and their shared experiences as directors. By the segment's end, the initial tension had transformed into mutual respect. I'd like that, Eastwood said, looking at De Niro. Maybe next time you're in California, you could visit my ranch. We could talk more about these issues without the cameras. De Niro smiled. I'd like that too. And if you're ever in New York, I know a few restaurants where they won't bother us too much. We could continue the conversation there. The audience broke into the loudest applause yet. Several people were on their feet. Even the cameramen and production assistants who normally maintained strict professionalism during filming were smiling broadly. That's all the time we have today, Patricia said as the show's theme music began to play softly in the background. Thank you so much to our guests, Clint Eastwood and Robert De Niro, for what has truly been a remarkable hour of television. And thank you for watching, Barbara added. We'll see you tomorrow on The View. As the credits began to roll, Eastwood and De Niro remained seated, still talking. The hosts tried to thank them again, but the two men were so engrossed in their conversation that they barely noticed. Should we cut their mics? A sound technician asked John through the headset. No, John replied. Let them talk. This is real. After the show ended, the studio slowly emptied. The audience filed out, still buzzing about what they had witnessed. The crew began breaking down the set. But Eastwood and De Niro moved to a quiet corner of the studio and continued their conversation for almost another hour. Finally, they stood and shook hands. De Niro took out his phone and handed it to Eastwood, who entered his contact information. I meant what I said about visiting the ranch, Eastwood told him. No cameras, no press, just a conversation. I'll take you up on that, De Niro replied. And I meant what I said about New York, too. They walked together toward the exit. An assistant approached to lead them to separate cars, but Eastwood waved him away. We'll share a ride to the airport, he said. We've got more to talk about. As they left the studio, Patricia turned to John. In all my years hosting, she said, I've never seen two people move from such opposition to connection so authentically. It wasn't just great television. It was a lesson in how Americans with different views might actually start talking to each other again. John nodded. That's the real story here. Not that they argued, but that they listened. 3 weeks later, a photo appeared on social media. It showed Eastwood and De Niro sitting on the porch of Eastwood's ranch, deep in conversation as the sun set over the California hills. The caption read simply, "Continuing the conversation. Common ground." The image went viral immediately. News outlets picked it up, political commentators discussed it, and ordinary Americans shared it with hopeful messages about healing the nation's divisions. No one knew exactly what the two men talked about that evening. No cameras recorded their words. No journalists reported their conversation. But something had started that day on The View, something important. A reminder that behind political labels are human beings with stories, fears, hopes, and dreams. And that listening to those stories might be the first step toward bridging America's deepest divides. For John Smith, who had orchestrated the initial meeting for ratings, it was a powerful lesson. Sometimes the most important stories aren't about conflict, but about what happens when the shouting stops and the listening begins.